Hello everyone, my name's Donna Gairns. I'm the National Nurse Director with Lymphoma Australia, and I'm joined today by Professor Judith Trotman from the Concord Hospital in Sydney. So welcome, Judith.
Pleasure.
No worries. This week, Lymphoma Australia and a lot of the haematology were to be at EHA, the European Hematology Association conference. However, due to COVID, we're all in our own countries and watching the conference from our comfort of our own homes. But this hasn't stopped us, so we've been trying to get updates from all the experts around Australia to be able to keep you up to date with the latest. So Judith has kindly agreed to meet with us today. Judith, you had a poster presentation at EHA about the Gallium study that you've been working with. Would you like to give us a little bit of a rundown on that?
Oh, look, thanks, Donna. As you know, the role of PET scanning in follicular lymphoma has long been a pet passion of mine for a decade now, and I've led a number of clinical trials that demonstrate the important prognostic value of PET scanning at the end of treatment for patients with their follicular lymphoma. And so we were very delighted to be able to add PET scanning into the protocol of the Gallium study, which is the largest randomized clinical trial for treatment of patients with what we call high tumor burden, advanced stage follicular lymphoma who need treatment. And this study had actually 1,200 patients in it, and during the conduct of the study, we actually did a protocol amendment to make PET mandatory in the centres where PET was available. And this study was comparing the standard rituximab antibody against the CD20 protein on the surface of the B-cell lymphoma cells in combination with chemotherapy against a second generation antibody called obinutuzumab. And this study has been running for well over 6 years now, and it demonstrated that giving obinutuzumab improved what we call the progression-free survival of patients compared to combining rituximab with the chemotherapy. So in the patients who had obinutuzumab and chemotherapy, 5 years after treatment, their probability of being free of progression or death was 70%, compared to only 63% for the patients who received rituximab with chemotherapy. However, there was actually no difference in the overall survival at 5 years. So the overall survival was exactly the same at 90 and 89%. And there was a trade-off in terms of additional toxicity with severe adverse events, what we call grade 3 toxicities occurring in an extra 8% of patients. And we know that obinutuzumab is probably a more immune suppressive and more powerful antibody. So that was the platform on which we did this additional PET study. In this PET study, we had almost, we had over 609 patients, so more than half the patient population who had the same characteristics as the patients who didn't have PET scanning. They had a PET scan at baseline. And the most important thing we established very firmly with that was that 98% of patients with follicular lymphoma have glucose avid, so PET positive lesions at diagnosis. And of that 98%, we had 87% of patients who had an end of induction PET that was evaluable using the now current standard PET assessment criteria. And we identified that 87% of those patients who had an evaluable PET scan obtained what we call as a complete metabolic remission. And if you can imagine the PET scan being a bit like a Christmas tree lights, where the lymphoma are the lights on a Christmas tree, and then they all get switched off at the end of induction treatment, and that's defined as being complete metabolic response. So we had 87% of patients who had complete metabolic response. And why is that important? Because in this poster, we were able to demonstrate that after 6 years of follow-up, that there was a sustained, substantial, a clinically substantially better improvement in that progression-free survival. So if you use a conservative cutoff of only 5 years, we could identify that 70% of the patients who obtained a complete metabolic response were free of either progression or death from either lymphoma or other causes 5 years after the end of induction, compared to only 29% of the patients who failed to get complete metabolic response, so for whom the Christmas tree lights were still shining, albeit dimly. So that was, what we call a 41% difference in 5-year progression-free survival. Or another way of describing it is to say that the patients who failed to get complete metabolic response had a 3.4 times higher risk of progression of their lymphoma or dying. And what was also important is we've got to remember now that patient walking in the door with follicular lymphoma in 2020 may be hoping to live for about 20 years, all right? Patients with follicular lymphoma on average live a very long time. And what we were able to identify at the end of induction treatment, that this PET scan can not only identify patients who are going to have an inferior progression-free survival, but an inferior overall survival. And why is that important? It's really important to identify the poor players, the players who are going to need something more than just standard antibody chemotherapy for treating their lymphoma. And we could identify that if you obtained complete metabolic response, 92% of patients were alive, compared to only 80%. So that's a 12%. That's actually a substantial difference in overall survival at only 5 years after the end of induction, where you've got such an indolent lymphoma where patients live on average for a very long period of time. So that was really important data to get us, and also to identify that while your progression-free survival was better in the patients who received obinutuzumab compared to those who received rituximab, the overall survival was 92% in the patients who received rituximab and chemotherapy and got complete metabolic response, and 92% in the patients who received obinutuzumab. So we're not seeing that, overall survival advantage of adding in the more powerful antibody. And I think that's really important, because I think we're in a bit of a sea change that, if I go back to the early data from the Gallium study, again, with 6 years of follow-up, we can't identify an overall survival advantage from this more powerful, more toxic antibody. So it's really important that we now, we don't just focus on progression-free survival, which sort of is an earlier and easier endpoint to identify for such an indolent lymphoma than overall survival. But we start thinking about what are the other endpoints that are really important to our patients. The toxicity of treatments, the number of times they have to come into hospital, the number of times they get recurrent bronchitis and sinusitis, which doesn't mean to say they have to come into hospital, but can, really severely impact on their quality of life, because we need to tease out the patient population for whom we probably do need to give more toxic therapies from those who are destined to do very well. And that's where the PET scanning is going to be really valuable. And that's why we in Australia and the Australian Leukemia Lymphoma Group are sponsoring, and Lymphoma Australia are supporting the PETREA study, the PET response adaptive therapy study, for patients receiving initial therapy for their advanced follicular lymphoma. So, Donna, I hope that has given you an appreciation, hope it's given our patients and their families an appreciation that the medical community is now focusing on things other than just, you know, a one treatment approach for all patients, and trying to identify how we can refine and do a more patient-specific treatments for their follicular lymphoma.
Exactly, and also looking at, as you mentioned, the side effect profile and the toxicities that patients need to live with for a very long time. So this really gives great insight for clinicians to almost decide which treatment is better for that particular patient too. So that's fantastic. If anyone wants to find more about the Patria study, you've actually done an interview with us a few months back, which is on our website as well.
Oh, great.
So
Okay.
tune into that and find more about
that, folks.
You did that one, yeah. So that's all good. So you can find out more. But and then it's fantastic. And there was another Gallium study that occurred during the conference too. Did you want to give us a little?
Well, that was the main one.
Was that the sorry?
So,
together, I thought they sounded familiar.
Yeah.
Sorry about
that. That's okay. It's really just the main update from the Gallium study that shows, and I sound like a broken record perhaps when I say it, the progression-free survival advantage at the trade-off of increased toxicity, along with no benefit in overall survival.
Exactly, and it's a long marathon that these patients need to run.
It's a marathon. It's a really good description.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time today. I think it's very helpful.
My pleasure.